Welcome to the Untethering Shame podcast, where we confront the invisible chains of shame that bind us and reclaim our authentic selves. I'm Kyira Wackett, your host, and today we're unpacking a particularly pervasive concept, the good child idea, and the unrealistic expectations it places on mothers. Joining me today is Emily Hardy, a motherhood support and mindset coach, host of the Worthy Mother podcast, and a champion for authentic, real conversations that shift the narrative for moms. For generations, women have been conditioned to believe they have to be perfect to be enough. These impossible standards have led many mothers to see motherhood as a job they're always failing at. The good child concept tells us that if we're good enough parents, our children will then be good enough or perfect, and any deviation from that ideal is a reflection of our inadequacy. The cycle not only burdens mothers with guilt and shame, but also projects unattainable standards onto our children, perpetuating a cycle of unrealistic expectations into adulthood. Emily is passionate about challenging these societal narratives. She brings her experiences as a motherhood support coach and podcast host to the table, where she advocates for self-compassion and helps mothers break free from these damaging mindsets. She lives on the Central Coast of California with her 2 little boys and is dedicated to helping moms redefine their worth beyond perfection. So join us as we explore how these societal expectations impact our view of motherhood and how we can break free from the cycle of shame to cultivate more compassionate and realistic relationships with ourselves and our children. Emily, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here.
I am so glad to be here, and just hearing all of that, I'm like, yes, this is what it's about. So
I know, I do feel like there's this magic, because I didn't realize this when I started guesting on podcasts, that most often you don't get to hear the full intro for your podcast, which I think sometimes is a really smart idea, because then if you completely go in a different direction, you haven't been pigeonholed by it and you can just re-record it. Sometimes people want to reflect on it. But I do think there's this magic of people listening to the introduction, one, to have to hear how they're introduced and take that compliment, take that celebration, but also we kind of like, there's this energy vibration that's happening while I'm reading where I can watch your head going,
yeah,
yes, yes. I'm like, yes, see, this is why we're doing this. And it just like kind of pumps us up, I think, which the listeners don't get to see, but now they know it's happening. It's the magic.
we are ready. We are excited to go.
So I love to start every episode just doing a feelings check-in. So I'm
Yeah.
curious, just coming into this, whether it's just your day in general, your week, your month. I heard recently that Mercury was in retrograde. I don't really know, but apparently it's been like a shit show for people because of the planets. So wherever timestamp you want to go, I'd love to hear one word to describe how you're feeling right now.
Yeah. Oh, I'm feeling really grateful right now, which is, that's not always the feeling that comes up, but just to get to have this conversation, and the fact that drop off this morning was easy enough for me to get ready and be here and be present and not be like frantic, which, half the time is what happens. And so just really grateful to get to share this space with you and have a really juicy conversation on something that I think we both really enjoy digging into.
Yeah, I love that. And I think just getting to that place where, sometimes these conversations can be difficult because we
Mm-hmm.
know we've got this professional lens that we're looking at it through. And you've experienced this both with children and with adults, kind of watching this
Mm-hmm.
from that lens. But then it's also very personal. And so as we dig into it too, it's this like, okay, I really do want to do this, but I also hesitate because I know there are probably some layers to this that I'm resisting in my own life. There are some
Yeah.
ways that if I'm going to be honest about this conversation, I have to lift the curtain to a depth that maybe I haven't wanted to. And that's sometimes, at least for me, that can feel really intimidating. And my shame is just sort of like waiting with bated breath for me to fuck up this conversation to then remind me of how much of a screw up I am in other ways too.
Yeah, I mean, that resonates really deeply, and I also feel something that goes with that is kind of the like excitement to have the opportunity to do that, because I feel like shame for me has always been something that, I mean, since I was a little kid, the shame has been right there with me. And so to be in a place in my adulthood where I get to have these conversations that aren't saying like, hey, moms, here's what you need to know. It's really like, no, I'm part of this too, like deeply. Sometimes it's like very, very real in present in my life, the things that I'm talking about. But getting to like have the open conversations and just understanding that when we share our own experiences and the experiences of others all together, that
Mhm.
that does give us the space to kind of release some of that shame. And that's been really transformative in my own adult life. And so it's a really exciting opportunity to get to do that and know that this conversation may touch someone who needs to hear it right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's that piece of, I don't know, when I was in school and learning about self disclosure as a therapist and realizing that so much of how we share, it's not that we're sharing about ourselves as the problem,
Mhm.
it's learning how to share about ourselves. And I think being able to do this and being willing to be like, yeah, no, I definitely have unrealistic expectations. And I'm going to call it out that these expectations are bullshit. Like, I appreciate that there are people on Instagram that are making a lot of money telling you about all the ways that you can do things. And they're doing their marketing on if you buy these 10 things, parenting's going to be easier, traveling's going to be better. But man, is that just perpetuating this idea that you should always be able to master whatever the system is when it comes to parenting. And I think that I'm assuming it's the same for you, but I'm curious when I became a mom. So Ev was born 2 weeks before the pandemic, which I think was both like a saving grace for me because my whole life turned upside down, anyways, becoming a parent. So I actually think I was a little bit protected of kind of the rip away of the rug that people had with it of like COVID. Oh my gosh. I'm like, look, I'm just trying to sleep for like an hour while my kid is, scream crying and whatever the case may be. But I realized very quickly in that isolation how much my behavior was driven by this perfection expectation. Like I had been a
Yeah.
mom for 4 days and I already had this, but you should know exactly what to do. And if you can't figure it out, the problem is on you. And when I got really honest with myself, that had been the expectation I had had in every role in my life and had been carrying since I was probably her age, but at least, as a young kid that I can remember. Is that kind of your same parallel?
It's really interesting for me to reflect on my becoming a mother in this way. And it's something that as I've gotten more engaged in some, academic research around motherhood, that I've kind of realized part of my experience has been, I'd say, unique in that I had my first at 23 unplanned. I was in school to get my teaching credential and I needed a lot of help and support. Like I needed it. It
Mhm.
was very much like I was not quote ready. And
Yeah.
it was that was the reality. I have, my partner was there, my family lived close. We made it work, but I think I had a little bit of, I don't even know if saying like self-compassion and grace is the right way to say it because I don't even know that that's really what it was, but it was more of this, well, obviously I need support right now. Obviously I need help.
Mm.
And I think there's something different for somebody who's like prepared and, ready to go in all the ways and then you're like, well shit, I need help and support.
Yeah. Like, I
And
chose this at
yes,
32, so I
yes,
should have it figured out versus
exactly.
yeah, oh, true.
So it's been interesting then learning about how that is a real thing that, if you fall outside of this kind of idealized image of what a perfect mom should be and you feel that you fall outside of that, that can actually be a way to kind of maneuver outside of kind of having those feelings of mom guilt and shame. Not to say in any way that I didn't have those feelings, but I think it looked a little bit different. And I think then in having my second son, dealing with mental health of my own and kind of
Mhm.
just navigating things differently. It was really in that experience having my second son where I felt more of the, okay, I'm still not getting this the way I thought I was going to get it. Like, don't you
Mm.
become good at like keeping things organized when you become a mom? Don't you? I don't know. My mom was good at finding things. Why do I always lose my shit? Like, I can't find the keys or my sunglasses. My mom was always really good at finding things. Isn't that just something moms are good at? So it's interesting reflecting on my own journey to motherhood in that way. Just realizing that like I think it did look different than someone who, they were ready to go for it. They felt like they should have been prepared because I didn't feel that way.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting. Two things that came up for me when you said that is one, the responsibility that we put on ourselves when we choose something. And I think
Mhm.
sometimes we sort of strip away the emotional experience and the learning opportunity. Like, I chose to start my own business. That doesn't mean I know what the fuck I'm doing. Like, I'm still learning and growing. That doesn't mean I have to be perfect, but in my head, I do. And it feels
Yeah.
like because I chose it, then the onus is on me. There's this radical responsibility that I've just got to figure it out. So I think one of those elements of, yeah, choice versus not choice, prepared versus not prepared, I think there's that piece. The second layer is realizing that you did it just through the different lens, because then when you
Mhm.
had your second child, it was, well, I should be good at this by now. Even though it's a brand new human, they're
Yeah.
not the same. You weren't the same person at that time. Your life circumstances were different. You also had another child in the mix. And so you are still brand new to this experience. But then even that at that point, you did the same thing someone else does, which is, I should have had this figured out by now. Why is this so hard for me? Did you
Mhm.
also feel a little bit less like when you were 23, it was, well, I do need help. It's okay to lean on people because I wasn't expecting this. I'm overwhelmed. Were you able to do that with your second son, or did you have less of that like willingness to let other people help you?
He was born in 2021. I mean, it was early 2021, still during the
Mhm.
pandemic. So I do think it is an interesting lens to look at it through. We do have a lot of support. My parents are very involved grandparents, and our son goes to daycare, our youngest goes to
Mhm.
daycare while our oldest is in kindergarten. I think I have been able to carry over some of that. It's okay to ask for help. And especially
Yeah.
because then I got into this work of like really digging into the fact that that's what we all need. Um,
Mhm.
that's not to say that it's not hard to ask for help, because it
Mhm.
definitely is. And there's times where it's like, am I doing enough? Am I like, those questions we ask ourselves.
Yeah.
But I do think I've been fortunate to like be able to kind of take that experience into the rest of the motherhood. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too, because I think my husband and I were talking about this last night, and he's like, the stories that you've been taught since you were a kid are very different than the stories that I've been taught about parenthood, about caregiving, about adulthood. And Everly and I went to Trader Joe's yesterday, and they have these like kid carts so she can grocery shop too. And so she was like filling up her cart with stuff. And we got to the checkout spot and she's unloading the cart. And like, she just really likes this idea. Like, she is grocery shopping. She is responsible for the avocados that we picked out. She is very excited about them. She sets them out in a certain way. And interestingly enough, the person that was checking us out was like, oh my gosh, what a good helper. She's a mother in training. And I was like, wait a minute. What? What?
Yeah.
She, nothing about what she's doing indicates that she wants to have children. So where did that come from? And so when we were talking about this last night, he's like, well, right, because you have been taught that your role is to take care of everything and everyone. And then in turn, you assume a responsibility for everybody else's life circumstances and what happens. And so in some ways that felt really good to you to hear that, because that's a reflection that you did good. Look at your good kid out here.
Yeah.
Your child is performing in the way that everybody else thinks is convenient and cute. And that's what anybody wants if they're going to be around a kid in a public setting. Now, on the flip side, what would happen if she was running around with the cart and bumping into people and doing these things, being a very typical 4-year-old if she was doing that? And so he talked about, if it was a dad there probably would have been a lot more leeway had the kid been doing that.
Yeah.
If Everly was running around, not paying attention, but because it's mom, the subtle expectation is this kid needs to be well behaved. And then look at how good this kid is. And then I come home going, look how good of a parent I am. Whereas he's like, I never had to think about that because that was never taught to me. Like, if I play ball with her
Yeah.
once a week and take her to school or pick her up one day a week, like, I'm an A plus dad, even
Yeah.
to this day.
And if he takes her to the grocery store and she's running around like like a nutty little
Yep.
4-year-old, it's like, "Oh my gosh, look at dad there going grocery shopping with his child." That is something I think is so it's important to talk about because we can be celebrated in those ways. And this is something that has definitely happened with me and my kids. And it doesn't feel necessarily very good when you're complimented on your kids behaving a certain way in public that is
Yeah.
seen as acceptable when you know that you're going to go home or you're going to get in the car and they're
Mhm.
going to have a meltdown over something or just like act like their typical toddler young kid
Mhm.
selves. And it's like, okay, I was getting praised. I went to a restaurant one time, I don't know what I was thinking. I took my then like 1.5-year-old and he was probably 3 to a restaurant for breakfast. It was kind of busy. We sat there. They were like angels. I'm like, whose kids are these? Like, but
Yeah.
they tend to do good at restaurants. We've kind of been taking them out and doing things like that for a while. So they're just more used to it, I guess, maybe than other kids. Not to
Yeah.
say they always act like angels. I mean, they were like patient and calm and sweet and eating their food and not making a mess. It's like I had nothing to do with that,
Right.
very little to do with that.
Right.
And had multiple people come up and say, "Oh, good job, mom. Like your kids are so great." And it is this weird feeling of like, okay, I'm being celebrated for this, but then
Mhm.
also knowing like they don't normally act like this. So like I'm a fraud. I'm not a good mom
Yeah.
because when we go home, my kid's gonna throw a tantrum and probably, scream at me and
Right.
whatever it is. Like it doesn't always look like that. And I'm sure anyone listening with kids can reflect on their own experiences where you maybe have been told, good job, mom, for something that really isn't necessarily reflective of the reality of like what it looks like to be a parent to your
Mhm.
children most days, most minutes, right? Like it's a weird feeling.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think what you just said that's key too is so last weekend, Everly's been having this weird thing where she doesn't wanna be wet, like, at all. Like, she'll go swimming because that's her
Mhm.
choice. But if she, like, spills a drop of water, and, like, literally a drop of water, she has a fucking meltdown. She needs to change her clothes. Everything is like, the world is ending. She got, like, 6 drops of rain on her, and when she was playing outside with her dad, and I wouldn't let her come in and change her clothes before dinner because they only had 5 minutes left, and, like, your next pair of clothes is gonna get wet. And, I mean, you would think that I had, like, abused her in some way,
Mhm.
like, the screaming tantrum. And so when we were at our soccer game, the grass was a little bit wet. It had been, it's the morning, so it's always a little wet, but also I think it had rained the day before, and she slid as she's, like, playing, and she got a little grass stain and a little water on her pants. And again, you would think that she just lost her arm with how intense this, like, crying was, and she came over, and I was like, "We're not doing anything about this. Get back out there and play the game." And as I'm doing this and I'm reinforcing this boundary, I've had 6 weeks of, oh my gosh, I cannot change your clothes 38 times a day because you may or may not have gotten 1 drop of water on them. We need to help your brain realize that water is not a threat, at least this kind of water. Like big oceans,
Yeah.
great. Different conversation. A drip of water, fine. But I can see the eyes on me, around me from the other parents, like, what a dickhead. Like she's crying, she just wants a hug, and you're just like shoving her back out there and being like, go. I'm not like, we're not having this conversation. I love you. You're fine. Go. And it was so interesting to sit with that and realizing, oh my gosh, how often do we make comments about kids' behavior or about how good a parent is doing based on one specific moment of content, like one point of data, instead of really thinking about the context. Now, there are
Yeah.
certain behaviors and ways of talking to kids or like certain things that I'm like, gosh, that's still like that's a problem area. But I think sometimes we place it like in your case, it was that one moment, everything looked wonderful, which if you take that compliment means something about you every other moment that things aren't wonderful or vice versa. Now I'm like, do all these people think that I'm a shitty mom because I'm not just like hugging her and holding her and getting her a new pair of pants because she just wants to play in dry clothes? And needing to reconcile, basically the root of both of those is this idea that we've been conditioned to believe that external appraisal and
Mhm.
validation and approval is the norm. That's what we need to seek. That's how we know if we're being good enough. And if the kids are not a reflection of that when they go out, then we're so afraid that the world is somehow like they're going to send out a newsletter to everybody that says, you know what, Emily's a really shitty mom. Her kids
Yeah.
got upset because it took 18 minutes for the food to come out and they should have been more patient. How did she not teach them that when they're 3 and 1.5? What a terrible human. She should go home until she can figure that out. Like, that's the fear in our brain, which seems crazy because that's not like that no one's going to hear that, and also that's just not how the real world works. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know how to go away from that when that's the system, but also saying like literally everybody is failing then by that standard all the time.
Which is, I think, how it feels for a lot of moms, not
Mhm.
necessarily feeling like everybody else is failing, but I think we all tend to feel like we're failing. If you just
Right.
don't approach it, if you don't, do this work to understand, like, okay, actually, if I look at the context, that's all of this messaging that I'm getting telling me that I'm failing isn't necessarily
Mhm.
accurate. But without doing that reflection, I think we really do mostly feel like we're failing in one way or another.
Mhm. I know. I thought even the there was a group of moms that we got together and everyone has so I have one child, all of them have 2 or 3, and so they're, I think, also comparing how different kids in their family systems do things too, and so we're talking about food, and as a former eating disorder therapist, like, I'm very aware of how I talk about food, how food is really the value that we place on food and being super
Yeah.
intentional about that. But also recognizing that kids are kids and they have this natural evolution with food that ebbs and flows with their interests, their willingness, their adventurousness, whatever it is. But one of the moms was talking about two of her kids pretty much eat everything. And then her oldest kid is like, I won't touch anything with a 10-foot pole. And how does she navigate that? And what do we do with that? And just this feeling of like, because I hear this come up all the time when we think about food. Even when we go to the grocery store, your kid eats this food. Gosh, my son is so picky, or my daughter won't eat any vegetables. And it's like the subtle messaging then is that they are good or bad based on what they
Yeah.
eat, which then is a reflection of them as a human. And then also us as parents, instead of
Yeah.
realizing, oh my goodness, that's just normal. That is totally normal. I go through phases where I don't like foods. Even now at 36, like what is it that makes us it's like we have a standard and we expect people to get there not only before they're ready, but then to stay there. And I think that's the piece where we get stuck is then we're focusing on a ceiling that we have to exist at versus the natural ebb and flow to be like, gosh, if one day your kids are great in a restaurant and the next day they are impatient and they're struggling and they are hangry, both versions of those kids deserve to be in that space. And
Yeah.
both versions of those kids represent full, whole people and are not indicative of you as a mom, whether you are good, bad, or neutral.
Yeah, what that bringing up for me very strongly is something that I've been really interested in exploring recently, just about how much parenting advice there is out there and how much we are like
Mm,
inundated with that right now. And a lot of it is good advice. Like I don't necessarily have a problem with the fact that we have access to information. We are a generation that is parenting a lot differently and very
mhm.
intentionally parenting a lot differently than parents before us did, right? Generations before us. Um, but with that comes this idea of, well, if you do it this way, this will be the result. And maybe it's not said in
Yeah.
that way, but I think we see that a lot with food. Again, I think it's amazing that there are really great resources out there. I follow a few I don't know if they're like nutritionists or occupational therapists, different people on
Yeah.
Instagram that share about how to get your kids comfortable eating different foods. And for me, I relate so much to that idea of like having two kids and one won't touch the food and one will pretty much eat what we give him if he's in the mood for eating. Otherwise, he'll just be like, no. But it's really great that there are resources because that can be a really challenging thing as a parent when your kid won't eat anything and you're trying to navigate like what is okay for me to say, okay, you're just going to have these foods that aren't very nutritious, and then when is it something
Mhm.
that I need to work on? That's a complex, nuanced conversation.
Mhm.
But sometimes these conversations come off as like, well, if you were just doing a better job introducing the foods the right way to your kid, right? And that's just
Yeah.
one example, but sleep, um, gentle parenting. If you
Yep.
talk to your kids the right way, then they will navigate their relationships with friends in certain ways. It's like, well, yeah, maybe, but
Right.
probably not right away. And they're still like it's still a 4-year old. Like,
Right.
what are we expecting? And then, the fact that a lot of times we can't implement those strategies in the way that they're like meant to be implemented. I just had a conversation on my podcast with a parenting coach, and we were talking about the gap in skills. Like, you can read all the
Mm.
books and know how you're, quote, supposed to parent to, be abiding by gentle parenting or respectful parenting, but that might not be something that you're capable of actually doing completely, because that's not, you don't necessarily have those skills,
Mhm.
right? That it takes to have those kinds of conversations and the patience and all these things. And so I think we end up in a space then where we feel like, well, if I was just doing this right, my kid would reflect that. They'd be this perfect little human.
Yeah.
And we can logically say, wait, that's not how it works. I don't know any perfect adults. They're not perfect, kids don't exist.
Right.
But the messaging is that if you did it right, you'd get the right result.
And I wonder, even as you said that, and you said, we're parenting different than generations before us, I think a lot about how sort of two layers of that. One, most of us grew up with our emotions being stuffed,
Mhm.
avoided, or kind of performed to meet whatever the adults around us wanted us to be. I still remember a moment where I was living at my aunt's house and I was really upset about something that had happened. And she looked at me and she told me to put on a happy face because she had a party coming on and this was going to get in the way of that. And I was like, that was people's norm. Like, hearing that,
Yeah.
anyone is going to go, yeah, let me tell you about this. Like, no one goes, wow, that's fucking terrible. Like, we processed emotions in my house. Like, some people did. The majority, and I think sort of the cultural norm when we were growing up, was that our emotions were a disservice to whatever was
Mhm.
happening because it was very action oriented. If we think about roles and dynamics, everything was output. This is what we're doing. Even having kids, what's their role? What's their function? And so there wasn't some of that nuance. And so I think two things. One, most of us are trying to parent different. Well, we're also still needing to reparent ourselves. So when you're like, well, yeah, if I could just gentle parent, like, I am a shame resilience therapist that works on healing deep seated shame and core belief wounds. And I can tell you that gentle parenting goes out the fucking window when my childhood trauma gets triggered because I haven't fully gotten through the process of healing it yet. And
Yeah.
I am reacting not to my daughter. Like, I can step back logically. I could go above and watch the scene and be like, this does not match what is happening. But my body has never been able to process and move through some of those feelings. And so it's really difficult. And so when we were little, if the idea was just fake it till you make it, put a smile on and work harder, then I think we've internalized this idea of, well, now we're supposed to do all of it and learn it on our own as quickly as possible, which keeps us in that action oriented instead of the insight building and the
Yeah.
processing. And then when it doesn't work, we reduce it to an effort problem. I am just not trying hard enough instead of going, sometimes kids just feel like shit and they don't know how to express their feelings other than yelling or throwing a tantrum. We can help them, we can guide them. But in this moment, they are feeling a big feeling that they don't know what to do with. And if you're being honest with yourself, the reason you probably want them to not experience it is because you don't know what to do with it yet either, because you
Mhm.
were never given the same space to feel it. And so I think it's this layered approach. And then again, all this advice, I do agree with you. I think it's wonderful how much access we have to it. And I think it still perpetuates the action idea.
Yeah.
Again, it's an effort problem. Do this and things will be better instead of realizing, try this. It might not work. either way, the fact that you're showing up every day and trying, that's a testament to love and commitment. Not that then your kid eats the magic food because you mixed it right and you put it in this little dinosaur shape and now they'll put it in their mouth.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of just grace that can come in acknowledging that our kids are not going to grow up to be perfect humans. Like it
Right.
really comes down to that. Like, what is the goal of all of
Mm.
this? And I don't know that we sit and think about that, but like, what is the goal?
Mhm.
And when you think about that, like, some people may be like, oh, so my kid can grow up and go to college. And then really think about that. Think about the expectations. There's a lot of ways we can think about these things and understand we may have these ideas of how we're supposed to be pouring into our children for them to become this idealized
Mhm.
adult. And I think that also, it comes back to when we talk about mothers feeling the pressure to be enough and to do enough and
Mhm.
to, be this perfect mother, right? If you think back to your own childhood and how did you feel like you had to exist as a kid? I mean, I know for
Yeah.
me, I've been recently really understanding like, oh, this whole like idea of me being this good girl. I was like, well liked by my teachers in school. And I was just so like well behaved. I didn't want to get into trouble. I felt a lot of shame if I did something wrong. And I just was like celebrated for being this good kid. And I was good at
Mhm.
school and, all these things. And it turns into being adults who also feel like we have to be the best at everything, like those perfectionist
Mhm.
tendencies, right? Where we feel like we have to be the best at everything and we feel like we have to be good at what we try. And if we're having a hard time at work or if we're having a hard time balancing work and having a family and we're having a hard
Mhm.
time raising our kids in any sort of way we thought we would, that it's like, yeah, that's a product of my upbringing and not even necessarily like these individual pieces of like, oh, you have to be good, but just like
Mhm.
me internalizing that that's my worth. And so we think about our own kids. In what ways are we perpetuating that? And in what ways
Yeah.
is just society in general perpetuating that? I think that's a really interesting thing. My background is as a elementary school teacher. And I have my master's in curriculum and instruction and have done a lot of like, work understanding how our school systems perpetuate
Yeah.
these things too. And it's really interesting when you think about like just like standards, school standards, the grade level standards that are fairly
Mhm.
arbitrary. It's not like, I mean, they're made up by somebody, right? And I think we saw that in the
Mhm.
pandemic, especially. But we expect our kids to hit these standards the same way as everybody else. And if they don't, what does that say about you as a parent? And for me, that's
Mhm.
something that's been really interesting, like navigating. I have a child who doesn't like he's not the perfect little kid in kindergarten that I was. I mean, I really showed
Mhm.
up and did the work and was nice and kind and cute and didn't get into trouble. And it's been a weird thing knowing that that's not who my kid is. And I don't expect him to be, but how do I kind of grapple with that and understand that? And it's something I think my background as a teacher has helped because I see that these are all kids. These are all imperfect little children. It doesn't really matter. There's things. I don't want to say we don't have influence as parents. Like we
Right.
have a lot of influence, but it's first of all, these things that we feel like are so, so important may not be.
Mhm.
And also, like, they're all people, our kids are people, and they're going to grow up
Mhm.
to be imperfect adults just like us. That was a lot, but I just, there's so much to get into there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's you saying all that and sort of like putting these different probes out is exactly what's happening in people's minds. And it's that layered element of it. And I think, I saw that growing up where I was very similar to you. I performed in a certain way. I've talked about this a lot on the podcast, but moments when I had that reinforced, when people treated
Mhm.
me differently based on those things. And there was a time even in high school and I was having my mom at the time was going to prison, and I was really struggling with this, and I was really struggling with the reality of what my life was versus what I thought it was gonna be, and I didn't really have I was being raised by my grandma at that point, and I mean, she did her best, but she was 60 years older than me, very different generation. Her ability to sit in and deal with some of this stuff was, probably on the same level as me. And I was so angry one day that I came into school and I started a food fight at lunch. Like I just was so hurt and angry and felt like I was out of control. And my friend Brian threw food back. Like he knew what was going on with me. He was one of the
Mhm.
very few friends that actually understood everything that I was going through. And I think the moment I picked up the food, he was like, "Oh, she needs me here. Like I'm in
Mhm.
this. Like I will rally with you." Now, I was a straight A in the top 5 at I don't know where I was at that point in terms of ranking, but like top 5 of my class. Like I was the National Honor Society president, like all of those things where you think about that specific character in a movie. I was that girl.
Mhm.
He was the skateboarder, the kind of bleach blonde, kind of stereotypical emo character, if you think about that in the movie script, who maybe got C's, probably a couple of D's, and didn't always show up for class. So both of us initiate this food. I mean, I initiate it. He's the second person, but we're really then the instigators, and everybody starts to get
Yeah.
involved, and all this happens. Well, the two of us end up in the principal's office, and our punishments were completely different.
Yeah.
He got an out of school suspension. I got like nothing. And I tried to stand up for him in this moment because basically they were coming in with, oh, well, he's already a troublemaker and not living up to his potential. This makes sense for him. So the punishment needs to be more this level. For you, gosh, that was just a youthful indiscretion. You didn't know any better, like that sort of idea. And it's like, no, I fucking know what I was doing. I just didn't
Yeah.
care about what everybody else thought about me in that moment because I was in pain. And he was the only other person in the pain with me. And so I tried to like speak up and be like, this isn't fair. And then we both ended up with in school suspensions. And it was this very weird dynamic. And I still think about this of like, gosh, I watched that play out. I watched that splitting of the paths, and we could break it down into race, into gender, into sexual orientation. Like we know that all the systems are designed that it's
Mhm.
not just ability and performance, but all these other layers that lead someone to be treated a different way. And so the interesting thing is, then when we assume this, it sounds like for you, you recognize the system has some problems. You also know that you still have to function in this system with your son right now.
Mhm.
And you don't want to perpetuate the ideals to make him feel like he's either broken and messed up or he needs to be perfect. So it's a really weird stuckness of like, how do you instill in him his value and his goodness and try to figure out how to support him in a system that is not designed for everybody to succeed, and recognize that you can only control what you can control. And that part, I think, is the tricky part for us of realizing we can't make the world completely different. The
Mhm.
expectations are still going to be there on us and our kids that
Yeah.
we are supposed to fix it and make it okay. So the only thing we can do is to decide I can't win every battle. Somebody's always going to find a reason that my kid or I am a problem. So instead, I'm going to focus on my values. And I think that's kind of what you were getting at, which is this notion of like, why are we doing this? What is it all for? What's really important to me? And if I think about if my son is sitting here at my age having a conversation, who do I hope he is as a person? And
Mhm.
what gifts do I want to give him to explore himself instead of feel like he's got to tunnel himself into one specific mold to be accepted in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think that really, like, captures it so beautifully. It really is we have to stop and think about what we value, and we have to stop and think about how we are communicating that to our kids and to others, right? When it's like they're not living up to this perfect standard of whatever it is. How do we hold space for that? And then, like, having self-compassion for ourselves to know that that's very unlikely that we will be able to just break out of feel like, get fully to a place of like everything we're doing is based on our values because our values tend to be very much inundated with all of the messaging we've got, right? Like we can't really separate
Yeah.
ourselves from the conditioning of the
Yeah.
last however many years of your life. There's a lot you can do to like reflect on it and dig, but you're always going to get to other pieces, right? And it's
Mhm.
unrealistic for us to expect that we're going to get to a place of like complete freedom from those standards because we exist in that world still. And
Mhm.
there might be things that actually are important to us and we do value, but it's really trying to parse apart like what is something I actually value and what do I think I value. I think kids going to college, I think, is a good example of this because I think that's
Yeah.
one that just it's like a good thing, right? Like it's a good thing for your kid to go through school and do well and try hard and get to a point where they can go to college and choose to go to college. If you really look at that, maybe that is something that is truly a value you have. But I think for
Mm.
a lot of people who that may be the expectation, it may not be as concrete as like, that's a value I have, right? And so
Yeah.
just recognizing that and trying to understand that it doesn't mean it's not important to you necessarily, but what does that value actually look like? And what is that reflecting? And I think there's a lot of areas of parenting that we can do that in.
Mhm.
And then knowing that like we still might fall into the patterns of perpetuating those things because again we can't be free of it.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like what you're describing, and I'm assuming this is some of what you do with people that you work with, is shifting out of those shame driven pressures to
Hmm.
values driven components. And so realizing, so a lot of the times I ask people, okay, maybe it's a bit of both.
Yeah.
Maybe you have this value, but it's also shame. How
Yeah.
we can start to tease it apart is what would happen if it didn't occur. Like for me, I love to be a yes person. I really want to help people out. I can pause and recognize that it's coming from a place of shame if I feel like if I don't say yes, my relationship is not it's in jeopardy, or someone's going to be mad at me, or I'm worried that someone's going to think I'm not committed. That's me putting my value on what anybody else thinks of me for that decision. Instead of realizing, gosh, I have this value of really showing up for people and being willing to be inconvenienced when I'm capable of taking that on, because I know how hard that can be for someone to ask for help. So I want to be a part of that system. But when I say no, gosh, it might not feel great because I want to be able to say yes, but I don't immediately jump to all of those dominoes that fall. And I think that's maybe a question for people to consider is, if we go back to the food thing for an example, or like a tantrum in the store, why is it so important to you that that doesn't happen? Or why is it
Hmm.
so important to you they have to act this way or eat these foods? And really pausing to just check in of, is that because that's what was prescribed to you as what it means to be a good mom or for them to be a good kid? Or oppositely, is it because it's such an important value for you? And you then have to figure out what that looks like to allow your kid to be a part of co creating what that value looks like to live in. And I think if we can get
Yeah.
to that place, I mean, my brain is still jumping. I know that we talked about this offline, that this is a conversation that I think is hours and hours and hours and it's iterative. And so we could keep going. But it is ultimately, I think, for me, when I can do that work, I think about my goal is to embody a sense of humility and a willingness to show up with grace and compassion for myself and for the world. And I want Everly to have that. And so when I think about those things, when I got really clear about, it was like, gosh, I have to handle every interaction perfect and it has to be this way. And I always have to have the answer. And I do this as the therapist. I do this as being mom. I do this as the fact that based on my husband's and my schedule, I'm the one with her more. So all these things, it was like, no, 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 I've got to have this. And now what I try to anchor on is, oh no, I'm going to screw this up because I am a human and
Hmm.
I don't always have all the answers. But when I really think about my value is more about I want her to see that I can be accountable for when I get it wrong. Because when I go back and I think about growing up,
Yeah.
I wish someone had done that. I wish someone had taught me you don't have to get it perfect to be in the room. I don't have to get it perfect to be okay. And so now I focus on that. And it's not a like get out of jail free card. I can be the biggest shithead anytime I want and just say sorry. But it's knowing, gosh, I want to model to her that she's going to fail and fail hard. And I hope she fails a
Yeah.
lot in reality. But I never learned how to do that. And so I have to be willing to learn with her instead of being perfect for her, which is going to rob her of any chance of breaking the cycle.
It is such a beautiful gift we can give our kids to like show our humanity and show that it's okay to be imperfect. It's what is going to happen. I think that when we think about it in that way, that we can gift our kids that, it's pretty incredible thinking then what can happen with the next
Yeah.
generation of kids that we're raising, where it's like maybe they'll get to a place where they're not feeling guilt and shame about things that don't actually matter to them. Like if we're
Yeah.
showing that, if we're showing that it's okay to say sorry and recover from something that didn't feel good and acknowledge it, acknowledge your fault in a situation. If you are showing that it's okay to
Mhm.
fail, if you're showing that like all these things, we can have self compassion for ourselves, we can give ourselves the space we need. If you're showing all of that, that's what they're
Mhm.
learning. And I'm sure they're not going to learn it perfectly, right? Like we're not just going to be able to show up in that way for ourselves automatically. Like you said, this is like the work that
Yeah.
you do like digging into these things with people, and it's like that. If that's a sign that like you're not going to
Right.
get it perfect, then like it's just something we have to accept. But like they can be better prepared to move into adulthood with a lot more compassion for themselves and for
Yeah.
others. And if they have kids, if they're parenting, if they are working with the generation to follow, right? What change is that going to have? And like that's a really like I get chills thinking
Mhm.
about it because it feels sometimes like we can't change the systems and the ways of being that are so like heavy on us, but it's like we actually do
Mhm.
have a lot of ability to like make change for future generations, and it's kind of exciting.
Yeah. And I do think that's such a beautiful way for us to reframe it as it's not on us to be perfect. It's on us to be willing to be a part of that process of
Yeah.
change. And so, again, just kind of shifting away from output and perfection standards to what do I need to unlearn to lay the foundation for my kids to learn? And maybe they carry the baton the next leg. And then their, kids, if they have them, carries it the next leg. And so I want you to imagine that you're listening to this, let's say 3 months from now, and you're having a day that you're stuck back in some of these stories and you've been putting a lot of pressure on yourself. You're feeling all these things. Maybe your son had a hard week at school. You're not feeling like he's getting the support. You're feeling like it's on you, or, one of them's not eating, whatever it is, you're getting back into that head place. Like you're getting fixated on, I've got to be the perfect mom and I need my kids to be good, and falling back there. What do you wanna tell yourself at that point to pull you back to this moment you're in right now to remind yourself of everything that you're saying?
I think reminding myself to share that out loud with somebody that I trust is huge
Mm.
because I think a lot of these pieces of shame, when we can just say it out loud to somebody who will be like, "Yeah, that doesn't mean you're a bad mom." Like,
Yeah.
just having someone say that
Yes.
to you, um, we can do that for ourselves. We can definitely, like, kind of logic our way out of it. I do find sometimes that, like, that really is helpful. Like, let me actually think
Mhm.
about this. Does that actually mean I'm a bad mom? Do I actually believe that? No. But I think
Mhm.
just sharing it and releasing that, like, burden of holding that,
Yeah.
feeling like I'm not enough because if you say to someone, "Yeah, my kid's having a hard time with friends at school. I'm such a bad mom for not teaching him how to navigate all the situations that he's gonna come across in school," and even just saying that, it's like, "Wait, that's
Yeah.
I don't believe that."
Yeah. I love that, and I think that's such a good reminder for all of us of shame gets its power from
Mhm.
silence, and so if we can say those things out loud, if we can create those connections. Okay, so I know there's gonna be a lot of people that are like, "I am ready to hop to your podcast," which we're gonna have links to the episode that we did together for your
Yes.
podcast, and then just I'm so excited for people to get the chance to hear more from you and all the wisdom of the guests that you bring on. But there's gonna be some people that are like, "Okay, I think I need to go a bit deeper in this," and I think that there's something about unlearning these systems, even as you say that, of like, say it out loud and talk to somebody you are going to be that person and they're feeling that. And so,
Mhm.
what's the best way for people to reach out to you, to connect with you? Where would they start if they are ready for that next level of this unlearning, rewiring, kind of shifting their perspective and that journey?
Yes. Well, okay, so my podcast is definitely a good place to kind of learn more about the conversations I'm having and the work that I'm doing with moms to just really start to have the conversations about what is going on in our world and the context that we're mothering in and figuring out what that means for our own experiences. I am on Instagram. My handle is at honestly Emily Rose. That's a great place to reach out and connect if you think maybe you want to do some one-to-one work, working on really talking through your own experiences and figuring out what's going on with, I talk a lot about mom guilt in the work that I do and understanding that as like guilt and shame and unpacking that and
Hmm.
learning to have more self-compassion. Instagram is a great place to start that conversation, see if maybe doing some one on one coaching is a good fit for you. It's really powerful to have spaces to be able to just say the things and be
Hmm.
validated in the fact that, like, it's okay to struggle, but it's also a lot of times the things that we're ruminating on are thoughts that actually aren't true to like what we believe. And that can be huge
Yeah.
working through that. I do a lot of mindset work and reframing thought work just to help us see that like we don't have to get so bogged down in the expectations that we don't actually value.
I love that. And I think for everybody listening, just reiterating the fact that Emily is not only a mom and not only focuses on from this lens, but also her background in education, her understanding of the school system, of thinking about those things, I think gives her such a unique position to be a support for people. Because I think for so many of us, the pressure gets layered into it as our kids go into
Yeah.
school and the ways that other people interpret their behaviors or their expectations that they're putting on our littles. And so just knowing that if you're like, yeah, I connect with her as a person, also realize that she's got this unique background and gift that makes her very different from a lot of people that are doing this work. And being able to offer you both sides, I think is such a gift that she can give to so many of you. So take her up on that. Reach out to her on Instagram. I love her podcast. Obviously, I'm biased to the conversation that we had. I thought it was amazing,
It
which is why
was.
I needed to have her on this podcast. But also, gosh, the people she brings in, it's the same energy. And I just think learning from Emily and the people alongside it. So, everybody, make sure you go down into the show notes. Check out all of those links, reach out to her, connect, at least just follow if you're like, I'm not ready yet, but I know that I need to learn more and just taking one thing with you. And hopefully, if you're listening to this, you can also set that reminder in a few months when your brain space gets bogged back into those negative thoughts of just coming out of it and talking to someone. And maybe that's the point you're ready to take those next steps. And so, gosh, Emily, thank you so much. This has been amazing. I love every moment I get to talk to you in any context. So, thank you for the gift of sharing all of this on this platform with all of us today.
Thank you so much for having me and just holding this space.
Yeah, it was amazing. Okay, everyone. Like normal, I want you to just kind of pause, take one thing with you. Remember, you can always come back. One thing with you today. That's all we're asking of ourselves. One small thing. We're working on that 1%. Come back to this as many times as you need to. And I will see you all back here next Sunday.